The dim lighting of Le Grand Trois, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, cast a warm golden hue over the perfectly arranged tables. Guests dined under the glimmering chandeliers, their conversations blending into a soft hum of wealth and privilege. It was a world of indulgence, where the elite gathered to sip aged wine and discuss million-dollar deals as if they were casual pleasantries. But for Elena Adams, this was not her world, it was merely the stage she moved through, unseen and unacknowledged. Dressed in her crisp black uniform, Elena weaved between tables with the practiced grace of someone who had long mastered the art of invisibility. She carried trays instead of melodies, responded to orders instead of applause. The patrons barely looked at her, their eyes sliding past as if she were just another fixture of the restaurant. But once, years ago, the world had looked at her very differently. Elena had been a child prodigy, a name whispered in concert halls with admiration. From the moment she first placed her small fingers on the ivory keys of a Steinway grand piano, it was clear she was meant for something extraordinary. Her music didn't just entertain, it spoke, weaving stories without words, moving audiences to tears, leaving them breathless in its wake. By the time she was 12, she had played in competitions across the country, her name appearing in music magazines alongside seasoned virtuosos. By 16, she had received a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country, a ticket to a future filled with standing ovations and world-class performances. But fate had other plans. Her world collapsed overnight. A financial scandal ripped through her family like wildfire, burning down everything they had built. Her father's company crumbled, drowning in lawsuits and unpaid debts. The scholarship, once secure, vanished in an instant. Without financial backing, the conservatory rescinded its offer. Their home, once filled with music and warmth, was seized. And in a final, cruel blow, her grand piano was sold, a necessary sacrifice to keep the family afloat. At just 17, she watched her future slip through her fingers, the once vibrant world of music shutting its doors in her face. The prodigy was no more. She tried to fight, to claw her way back, but the world wasn't kind to broken dreams. Music no longer paid the bills. It didn't put food on the table. So she stopped playing. The melodies that had once poured from her fingertips turned to silence. Now, 7 years later, she barely recognized herself. The once brilliant pianist had become a waitress, living paycheck to paycheck, serving meals to those who had never known hunger or desperation. And yet, the past refused to let go. In the far corner of the restaurant, a Steinway grand piano stood, gleaming under the dim lights like a relic from a forgotten era. She never let herself look at it for too long, never let herself remember how it had once felt to sit before one just like it. But no matter how hard she tried to bury the past, the music was still inside her, waiting. Tonight, however, she would be forced to confront it again. And this time, the world would listen. The moment William Sterling stepped into Le Grand Trois, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. It was subtle but undeniable, the way the air seemed to thicken, how conversations lowered into hushed murmurs, and how the staff instinctively straightened their postures. This was a man who commanded attention without uttering a single word. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, Sterling moved with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. He was a self-made billionaire, or so he claimed, though his rise to power had come at the expense of many others. His empire had been built on high-risk investments, corporate takeovers, and an unrelenting drive to eliminate competition, no matter the human cost. To the elite gathered in the restaurant, he was a figure of admiration, a model of ruthless ambition. But to Elena Adams, he was something else entirely. She recognized him the moment he walked through the doors. How could she not? His name had been stamped on the darkest chapter of her life. It was Sterling's company that had led to her family's downfall. His aggressive acquisitions had swallowed the firm her father had dedicated decades of his life to, leaving them in financial ruin. It had been his unchecked greed that turned her world upside down, forcing her to abandon her dreams. And yet, as he strode across the room toward his private table, he didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, another nameless server in a uniform, someone beneath his notice. Elena felt a tight knot in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain composed. This was just another night. Just another table. She watched as he took his usual corner seat, a spot reserved for him whenever he pleased, whether he had a reservation or not. His entourage followed, a small group of business partners, their laughter overly enthusiastic, their smiles carefully practiced. Beside him sat a woman in an emerald green dress, beautiful and poised, draping herself over his arm with the ease of someone accustomed to wealth. Elena exhaled slowly, gripping the tray in her hands, steadying herself. Then, with the same practiced grace she had perfected over years of working in fine dining, she approached his table. "Good evening," she said, her voice even. "Can I get you started with anything?" Sterling didn't look up immediately. Instead, he swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the liquid move with detached amusement. Then, finally, his sharp eyes flicked up to her. "What's your name?" he asked. Elena hesitated for half a second. She wasn't expecting that. "Elena," she answered simply. "Elena," he repeated slowly, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Then, a smirk curled at the corner of his lips. "Tell me something, Elena. What do you do when you're not serving tables?" The question sent a chill down her spine. There was something about the way he said it, too direct, too intentional. She knew this game. Men like him played it often. It was a test, a way to establish control, to remind others of their place. "I work," she answered, keeping her tone neutral. Sterling's smirk deepened. "A shame," he mused. "A face like yours, I would have thought you had bigger dreams." His companions chuckled, his date offering a polite but uninterested smile. Elena's fingers tightened around the tray. She refused to let his words get to her. "Would you like to hear tonight's specials?" she asked, her voice unwavering. But Sterling wasn't finished with her yet. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with something cruel, something calculated. "Actually," he said, dragging out the word, "I heard something interesting." Elena's heart stopped. "A little birdie told me you know how to play the piano." She felt the blood drain from her face. For the first time that night, Sterling had her full attention. The moment William Sterling uttered those words, a chill ran down Elena's spine. "I heard you know how to play the piano." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a deliberate trap, carefully laid out for her to walk into. Elena felt her breath hitch. How did he know? She had spent years burying that part of her past, ensuring it remained hidden from the world. The last thing she wanted was to resurface it here, in front of an audience that would see it as nothing more than entertainment. "I used to," she replied cautiously, keeping her voice even. "A long time ago." Sterling's smirk widened. "Perfect. Why don't you play something for us?" A flicker of unease spread across the table. Even his business partners exchanged glances, sensing the tension in his tone. His date in the emerald dress hesitated, as if unsure whether this was supposed to be a joke or not. Elena's fingers tightened around the tray in her hands. She wasn't a fool, she knew exactly what Sterling was doing. This wasn't about music. It wasn't about talent. This was about power. He didn't want to hear her play. He wanted to humiliate her. She was the waitress, the invisible servant, the one people barely noticed unless they needed something. And now, he was putting her on display, forcing her into a performance she never agreed to. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew what would happen if she refused. He would make a comment, something sharp, something cruel. He would call her a liar, a fraud. The entire restaurant would whisper about it for weeks. And worst of all, he would win. She swallowed hard, trying to calm the storm rising in her chest. She hadn't played in years. What if she failed? What if she sat at that piano and froze? What if? No. A different thought cut through the fear, clearer than anything else. Why should I be afraid? She had spent years running from her past, convincing herself that the music inside her no longer existed. But it did. It always had. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was the night she took it back. Elena exhaled slowly, then lifted her chin and met Sterling's expectant gaze head-on. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He hadn't expected her to accept. The room fell silent as Elena carefully set down her tray and turned toward the grand piano. The Steinway stood in the corner like a relic from another life, its polished surface gleaming under the restaurant's golden lights. She walked toward it slowly, every step heavier than the last. The tension in the air was palpable. Some guests leaned forward, eager for the spectacle, while others exchanged curious glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. Sterling leaned back in his chair, his whiskey swirling in slow, lazy circles. His smirk had returned, full of amusement and anticipation. He thought she was walking toward her own humiliation. He had no idea what was coming. Elena sat down at the bench, her hands resting on her lap. The piano keys glowed under the dim chandelier light, as familiar and foreign as an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. For a moment, doubt gripped her. What if she had forgotten how to do this? Then, in the silence, she remembered. She remembered her mother's voice, full of pride, telling her she was born to play. She remembered her father closing his eyes, swaying gently to her music after a long day's work. She remembered the first time she had touched a piano, how it had felt like coming home. And she remembered why she had stopped, the shame, the loss, the heartbreak. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. No more running. She exhaled softly. Her fingers found their place on the keys. The moment they touched the cool ivory, a strange calm settled over her. Muscle memory kicked in, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. She pressed the first note. A single, haunting sound drifted through the restaurant, delicate and pure. The air shifted. Sterling's smirk faltered. She played the next note. Then another. The melody unfolded, slow and deliberate, like a whisper in the dark. It wasn't just music. It was memory. It was loss. It was a reckoning. The game had changed. And William Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Elena's fingers hovered over the keys, her pulse pounding against her ribs. The restaurant was silent, too silent. Every breath, every shift in a chair, every clink of silverware had ceased. All eyes were on her. Waiting. Watching. At the back of the room, William Sterling leaned back in his chair, his whiskey glass balanced between his fingers. His smirk was still there, but it had changed, less amusement, more calculated curiosity. He thought he had won. He thought he had pushed her into humiliation. But he had just handed her a stage. Elena pressed the first note. A single, fragile sound drifted into the air, soft, aching, deliberate. It rang out like a whisper, stretching through the silence, lingering long enough to make every listener hold their breath. Then she played the next note. And another. Slowly, the melody unfolded, delicate yet powerful, like a story being told in hushed tones. The restaurant shifted. At a nearby table, a woman in a navy blue dress who had barely acknowledged Elena earlier leaned forward, her wine glass forgotten. At the bar, a businessman who had been laughing at one of Sterling's crude jokes now sat frozen, his brow furrowed in quiet disbelief. Even the servers, Elena's co-workers, stood by the entrance, trays clutched in their hands, watching with something like awe. They weren't just listening. They were feeling. The piano was no longer just an instrument, it was an extension of her soul, a voice she had silenced for years now roaring back to life. She played not for them, not for Sterling, not for the restaurant, but for herself. And the music responded. The melody swelled, deep and rich, filling every corner of the room. It was not just a performance, it was a reckoning. William Sterling's smirk was gone. His fingers had tightened around his glass, knuckles turning white. The usual dominance in his posture had vanished, replaced by something he couldn't quite mask, discomfort. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. No one was looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. His business partners were no longer amused, they were entranced. His date, the woman in the emerald dress, was no longer focused on him, she was watching Elena, her expression caught between admiration and disbelief. The power in the room had shifted. And Sterling could feel it. Elena did not stop. Her hands moved faster, building momentum, confidence pouring back into her veins like a dam breaking free. Every note was a declaration, I am here. I never left. The melody soared, carrying with it the weight of every moment she had lost, every doubt, every voice that had told her she wasn't enough. And then, the final chords. She poured everything into them, letting them crash and rise like waves against the shore. The last note hung in the air, a final, unshakable declaration. Then, silence. A silence so thick, so absolute, it was almost deafening. Elena slowly lifted her hands, letting them hover above the keys before resting them in her lap. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single clap. Then another. Then, the entire restaurant erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as people rose to their feet. Some clapped politely, others wildly. A few, like the older man at the bar, simply sat stunned, hands clasped together as if they had just witnessed something sacred. Elena turned, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. And when her gaze met William Sterling's, she saw something she never expected. For the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. Elena turned away from the piano, her heart still hammering in her chest, the final notes of her performance still ringing in the hushed air. The applause had not stopped. In fact, it had grown, louder, fuller, more relentless. Chairs scraped against the floor as people rose to their feet, hands colliding in thunderous approval. Some clapped politely, others with a raw ferocity that sent chills down Elena's spine. A few, like the older gentleman at the bar, simply sat in stunned silence, hands clasped together, their expressions carrying something almost reverent. Elena took a slow breath, steadying herself as she stood. And then, her gaze met William Sterling's. He hadn't moved. He was still seated, his whiskey glass poised midair, but the usual easy arrogance had vanished from his face. His grip on the glass was tight, his jaw set, his once bored smirk completely gone. For the first time all evening, he was not in control. His date, The woman in the emerald dress had leaned in to whisper something to him, but her eyes were still on Elena, filled with something between admiration and amusement. Sterling barely reacted. His business partners, who had laughed at his every joke earlier, were now ignoring him completely. They were murmuring among themselves, still captivated by what they had just witnessed. Elena took a step forward. Slow. Deliberate. She had spent the entire night trying to avoid Sterling's attention, but not anymore. She approached his table with unshaken confidence, her posture straight, her presence unignorable. The restaurant had quieted again, the applause fading into murmurs as people leaned in, sensing that this moment was far from over. Sterling's gaze lifted, his expression carefully neutral, but Elena could see it, the faint tightening of his lips, the way his fingers drummed against the glass, the forced composure of a man who had just lost something important. She stopped just a few feet from him and tilted her head slightly. "Is this what you wanted, Mr. Sterling?" Her voice was calm, not mocking, not angry, just piercingly steady. A ripple of unease spread through the nearby tables. Some guests exchanged glances, others simply watched, wide-eyed, as the tension between them thickened. Sterling let out a low breath and forced a chuckle, straightening his suit jacket as if trying to regain some semblance of control. "I have to admit," he said, keeping his tone light, "I didn't expect that." "No," Elena replied, her eyes unwavering. "You didn't." The weight of her words hung in the air. For the first time, William Sterling had nothing clever to say. Elena let the silence stretch, let it sit heavy between them, before adding, "I suppose it's a good reminder, wealth doesn't make you the smartest person in the room." A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the crowd. A few suppressed laughs rippled through the guests, quiet but unmistakable. Sterling's jaw clenched. He had spent the evening believing he was orchestrating the night's entertainment, the one pulling the strings. But now, he was the one being watched. And he hated it. Before he could form a response, a new voice entered the conversation. "That was extraordinary." Elena turned to see an older gentleman stepping forward from the crowd. He had silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of presence that commanded respect. She recognized him instantly. Dr. Richard Langley, a renowned music professor, a patron of the arts, and one of the most influential voices in the classical music world. Elena's breath caught. "I've seen many pianists in my life," Dr. Langley continued, his voice thoughtful. "But very few play with that level of passion and soul." The murmurs grew louder. Other guests nodded in agreement. For the first time, they were seeing Elena for who she truly was. The professor reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, extending it toward her. "I'd like to discuss your future in music." Elena froze. A future in music. For so long, she had told herself it was impossible, that the door had closed forever. But now, here it was, swinging open right in front of her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took the card, feeling the weight of possibility settle in her chest. Behind her, Sterling shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between the professor and Elena, as if trying to process how the night had flipped against him so completely. But it didn't matter. Elena had won. She had walked into this evening as a waitress being mocked by a billionaire. She was walking away as something far greater. And she had no intention of ever looking back. Elena sat at the small wooden table in her apartment, the dim glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. In front of her lay a single business card, its pristine white surface a stark contrast against the worn tabletop. She had stared at it for hours, running her fingers over the embossed letters, tracing the name that held a door to a future she had long thought was locked forever. Dr. Richard Langley, chair of the music department at one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. Her mind replayed the events of the night before, each moment still vivid. The way the restaurant had fallen silent when she played. The shift in Sterling's face from amusement to disbelief. The applause that had shaken the very walls of the establishment. But more than that, she remembered the way she had felt, for the first time in years, alive, whole, unafraid. And yet, her hand hovered over the card, hesitating. Could she really do this? For years, she had convinced herself that music was a closed chapter in her life. She had buried that dream so deep, afraid to hope, afraid to try, afraid to have it ripped away from her all over again. What if she failed? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Maya, her best friend and roommate, entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She set one down in front of Elena, then took a seat across from her, arms crossed, expression knowing. "You're overthinking," Maya said simply, blowing on her tea. Elena let out a dry laugh, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple." Maya arched a brow. "Why not?" Elena gestured at the card. "He saw one performance. That doesn't mean I can do this again." "What if?" Maya cut her off. "What if you're amazing? What if this is exactly what you were meant to do?" Elena swallowed hard. The words settled uncomfortably in her chest, because deep down, she knew Maya was right. Maya leaned forward. "You already proved yourself, Elena. The only person doubting you is you." Silence filled the room. Elena exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the business card. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she reached for her phone. Her pulse quickened as she dialed the number. The line rang once. Twice. Then, "Dr. Langley speaking." Elena squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, taking a deep breath. And then, with quiet determination, she took the first step toward reclaiming the dream she had once lost. Life has a way of pushing us away from our dreams, making us believe that our passions no longer matter. Elena's story is a testament to the fact that no matter how much time has passed, true talent and purpose never disappear, they simply wait for the right moment to be rediscovered. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that self-worth is not defined by circumstance. Elena spent years believing she was just a waitress, allowing the world to see her as nothing more. But the moment she reclaimed her identity as a pianist, the world responded in kind. This teaches us that how we see ourselves dictates how others perceive us. If we carry ourselves with confidence and dignity, people will recognize our value. Another important takeaway is that the best revenge is success. William Sterling sought to humiliate Elena, but instead, he handed her the stage she needed to prove her worth. She didn't fight back with anger or humiliation, she let her talent do the talking. There is no greater way to silence doubters than by showing them that you were never beneath them to begin with. Most importantly, this story reminds us that it is never too late to reclaim our dreams. Elena thought her time had passed, that her gift no longer mattered. But one bold choice, choosing to play again, changed everything. No matter how much life takes from us, we always have the power to take it back. Our dreams don't die, they wait for us to be ready.